involving photos of former White House counsel Vincent Foster. A lawyer named Allan Favish is trying to have Foster's death scene photos released. The office of former independent counsel Kenneth Starr and Foster's family are seeking to block him. Here are remarks from Allan Favish outside the Supreme Court following oral argument on Wednesday.
My name is Allan J. Favish, A-L-L-A-N, middle initial J, Favish, F-A-V-I-S-H. And I just argued the case of OIC versus Favish, dealing with my attempt to get released under the Freedom of Information Act 10 Polaroid photographs taken of Vince Foster's deceased body as it lay in Fort Marcy Park, July 20th, 1993.
Why do you want these photos?
Because the government's investigations, primarily the Fisk and Starr offices of independent counsel, issued reports which are demonstrably untrustworthy. And in my briefs, which, by the way, people can read the government's briefs and my briefs on my website, allanfavish.com, and see the papers, but we see that significant evidence was omitted from the Fisk and Starr reports that pointed to something other than suicide in the park. Let me give you a few quick examples, and these are laid out in the briefs. Number one, there was a doctor's memo that was written by the only doctor to view the body at the park, Dr. Hout, 2-page memo. And page 2 of that memo said that the gunshot that killed Mr. Foster was mouth to neck. The problem with that is that officially there was no neck wound, and it was a mouth to head shot. Now, what did Robert Fisk and Kenneth Starr's office do with page 2 in that regard of the Hout report? Nothing. They did not tell the public about it. But we know it exists. It's undisputed that it exists. Also, 2 days after the death, 1 day after the autopsy, there was a memo from an FBI agent to the director of the FBI at the time, who was Floyd Clark. Louis Freeh had not yet been sworn in, William Sessions having been fired a few days before Mr. Foster's death. This FBI memo said there was no exit wound. That contradicts the official government story of a .38 revolver into the mouth with a bullet out the back of the head. This FBI memo was not mentioned in the Fisk or Starr reports on this death. Those two factors alone make those reports untrustworthy. And I say the people can no longer trust the government in this case to filter the evidence for them, and the people must see the evidence for themselves. In addition, there are service records on the X-ray machine that was in the Virginia Medical Examiner's office the day of Mr. Foster's death and the next day for his autopsy. The autopsy doctor, Dr. James Beyer, wrote on the medical forms that he took X-rays. Later on, he said that the X-ray machine was broken, and that's why there were no X-rays of Mr. Foster. The service records for that X-ray machine show that the first service calls for that machine were made 3 months later. In other words, if Dr. Beyer was correct that the machine was broken in July, why aren't there service records showing that the X-ray machine had been serviced then? And these X-ray records were obtained by Accuracy in Media in a separate FOIA request, and these X-ray records, which contradict the autopsy doctor's statement that the X-ray machine was broken in July, are never addressed in the Fisk and Starr reports. We also know that witnesses in the park that day reported seeing a brown car. The problem is Mr. Foster's car was gray. There were 4 or 5 witnesses who saw this car. They all reported brown. Mr. Fisk and Mr. Starr in their reports did not tell the people that all these witnesses did not report seeing a gray car. Yet they concluded that Mr. Foster's car was in the parking lot. There is a whole list of things that are spelled out in my brief to the Supreme Court that show that we cannot trust the government to filter the evidence here. And these photos in particular are very important. One of these photos may be a photo of an alleged neck wound to Mr. Foster, which officially does not exist. We do know that one of the paramedics at the park reported seeing what he described at the time as what appeared to be a .22 caliber entrance wound on the right side of Mr. Foster's neck below the jawline. Officially, that's not what happened. Yet this paramedic reported that and stuck to his story until several years later when, according to the Star report, he said, well, maybe I was mistaken. Well, you can talk to this paramedic, Richard Arthur, yourself and find out what he really feels about this. We also have two books that came out in 1997, one by Ambrose Evans Pritchard, one by Christopher Ruddy. Both of them talked about a man named Miguel Rodriguez, who had just come to work for Starr's office in 1994. He was there for 6 months. He was working on the Foster case for Kenneth Starr's Office of Independent Counsel. He quit after 6 months. Publicly, we don't know why he quit, but he went back to his previous job of being an assistant U.S. attorney in Sacramento, California, where he is today. He also quit with an assistant he had at Starr's OIC named Lucia Rambush. I don't know where she is now. I do not think she was a lawyer at the time. These books describe a cover-up primarily by FBI agents who worked for the Starr Office of Independent Counsel in hiding some photographs from Mr. Rodriguez. And when he finally got a hold of them, then again, these are allegations in these books citing unnamed sources. I don't know what's true or not, but they would not blow up the photographs and allow him to see it. Supposedly, one of these photographs contains this neck wound, which of course would contradict the official story. That's why I believe that one of these photos may be that. Now, I don't know for sure, because there are also reports in the record from Park Police Officer John Rolla and others about photographs that were taken that suddenly turned up missing. And that's a whole other part of the story. So to find out what happened with Miguel Rodriguez and whether he quit because there was a cover-up and there is a neck wound photo, I asked the district court and the Ninth Circuit in this case to allow the deposition of Ms. Rambush and Mr. Rodriguez to be taken simply for the purpose of asking them if what's in these two books is true. Because if he says that it is true, then the courts here have a problem. Because in this case, the district court judge was supposedly shown the original 10 photographs that we're fighting over. These are Polaroid photographs, and the judge looked at them in private. It's called looking at them in camera. And then he made a decision. He said 5 of them should be released to the public. The Ninth Circuit then looked at photocopies of these 10 original Polaroids and decided that only 4 of the 10 photos should be made public. But if what is recounted about the experience of Mr. Rodriguez and Ms. Rambush as recounted in these books is true, then what we have is a cover-up. But we don't know about that until we get their testimony, and then there's no way to trust that the government is showing the courts the original photographs if what's alleged in these books is true. And that's one of the issues before the Supreme Court, too, whether we should take Mr. Rodriguez's deposition. Yes?
Favish, is it your contention that both the Fisk and the Starr investigators looked at these photos, knew that they did not support their conclusion that Vince Foster committed suicide, and are intentionally putting their reputation, the reputations of the OIC and the government of the United States behind a cover-up just because they don't agree with what the photos say? Is that your contention?
That is not my contention. My contention is I don't know for sure what's in the photographs. We have a brief description for each of the photographs because a publicly available document released in January of 1995 is an evidence receipt from the FBI talking about that. And I believe that these photos will shed light on what happened to Mr. Foster, but I don't know for certain. And if you can excuse me for 10 seconds, I have to take this call, and I'll be right back to the microphone. Hello? Hello? Okay. Yes.
So, what is the compelling interest for the public to have these pictures made public that overrides the family's asserted right to privacy and the OIC's contention that the investigation is solid, is credible, and these photos add nothing to the body of knowledge?
First of all, the law does not require that the showing be compelling. in this balancing process, if they do find a privacy right here, which I don't think they should, because I believe that privacy is the right to control information about yourself, and there's no information about the survivors in these documents. If they do balance that, the interest that the public has is that they cannot trust the government to filter the raw evidence in this case. And with regard to the investigation that was done by the government as to what happened to Mr. Foster, all we can do is make educated guesses. But with regard to the government conduct in reporting about that investigation to the people, which was done in the Fisk and Starr reports, we don't have to get into speculation. We don't have to get into educated guesses. We know to a 100% certainty that those reports to the public omitted key evidence that pointed away from suicide in the park. Things like the Hout medical report that talked about a neck wound, the FBI no exit wound, the statements of the witnesses that reported seeing a car color different than what Mr. Foster had. So we know already that we cannot trust the government reports, and that is the reason that the public has to see this information for itself.
Do you believe Vincent Foster was a victim of foul play?
Again, all I can do is make an educated guess about what happened to Mr. Foster. My best educated guess is that he was murdered, but that's just an educated guess. The issue here is the public shouldn't have to make an educated guess. We should have all the facts, and all the facts were not presented in the Fisk and Starr reports. Very, very important evidence was omitted. So the public should see the raw evidence for itself, so it doesn't have to engage in educated guesswork the way it is now. We're just outside of 40 years after the murder of President Kennedy, where the government has two official conclusions about the death. Warren Commission says a single shooter, and the House Assassinations Panel says there was, they say there was a second shooter. The Warren Commission said there was a single shooter. I don't know where we're going to be in 30 years from now on this.
If one embarks upon a course of educated guessing, as you're doing, it leads sort of inextricably to the fact that there is a conspiracy here, yet such a conspiracy involves such diverse parties that it would be truly impossible or highly improbable. Why most people would have dropped such a quest at this point based upon the improbability of such a conspiracy?
Again, I'm not alleging that there was a conspiracy. I'm alleging that the Fisk and Starr reports cannot be trusted because of the major omissions. And if the photos do come out and they are consistent with the Fisk and Starr reports, and there's a lot more evidence in this case that has not been released to the public, by the way. Mine was a very narrowly focused suit on some of the photographs. But hypothetically, the evidence that can come out, it could exonerate the Fisk and Starr reports in terms of their bottom line. And as I argued to the court, the bottom line of these reports may very well be correct. Maybe it was suicide in the park. But we cannot conclude that from these reports. That's all I'm saying. And the purpose of the FOIA is to allow the people to be in a position where they don't have to be spoon-fed by their government about what the government is doing. We have a right under the FOIA and in this democracy to see the raw evidence for ourselves, to be a check on government, to help ensure honest government, to help ensure the integrity of our law enforcement agencies. And that's the purpose of FOIA that will be served here.
Do you stand in any way to profit from the release of these photos? Would you in any way use them for any sort of profit motive?
If the photos are released, they're not just released to me. They're made available to the public at large. So there's no way that I could profit in terms of publishing the photos. They would be just as available to you as me. That's what happens with a release under FOIA.
Have you had any particular financial support in pursuing the legal challenges you have brought in this case?
No, I haven't. I brought this case in my own name. I'm the FOIA requester, and I happen to be a lawyer, and I've been able to handle the case myself, except for the very beginning where a law firm that I worked at filed the initial complaint. I do have to take this call. I'll be right back. I'm back.
Excuse me 1 second.
Sure. Oh, okay. Oh, I didn't fully answer your question about the breadth of this conspiracy and so forth, if it exists. And I want to say that if there was an intentional cover-up here, and by the way, my argument to the court is that part of the public interest here is in uncovering government negligence as much as it is in uncovering intentional corruption. So if the Fisk and Starr reports, which we know were at least negligent, even though there may have not been intentional cover-ups going on, then the public has an overriding interest in seeing these documents. Now, if there was an intentional cover-up, what would the breadth of that conspiracy be and how many people would have to be involved? I don't know. We can just make educated guesses about that. But certainly the news media, if I may be so bold to criticize, should have been doing this lawsuit. There's no reason why I, a public citizen, had to do this. Where was the Los Angeles Times and the big networks and so forth and so on? Why aren't they trying to talk to Miguel Rodriguez, an assistant U.S. attorney in Sacramento, California? Why aren't they pointing out to the public the massive omissions of relevant evidence that points away from suicide in the park that was in the Fisk and Starr reports? It's in my brief. It's undisputed by the government and the Foster respondents. Yet the media has barely pointed this out to people. I don't know why that's happened. It was citizen investigators who read the nearly 3,000 pages that were released by the Senate Whitewater Committee in January of 1995 and analyzed those pages and compared it to the only report out at that time was the Fisk report and found these major omissions. I don't know why the press has just laid down on this case. I really don't understand that.
How do you account for the fact that the information you're seeking would be extremely relevant to the family of Vince Foster in settling in their mind, if it is in any way unsettled, what actually happened to Vince Foster? And yet they oppose this effort. It suggests to me that those most intimately interested in the question you say you're attempting to answer have already come to the conclusion themselves. And in my history of covering cops, a lot of times that's dispositive for police. If the family's satisfied, they're satisfied.
Well, I have no way of assessing the motives of the Foster family members other than what they've said about the grief that they claim that they would suffer if they had to see the photographs or be contacted by the media in connection with the release of the photographs. So I don't dispute them on that. I can say that personally for myself, if a family member had died and I wasn't satisfied with, well, let me put it this way. If government reports about one of my family members' deaths had omitted as much relevant evidence that pointed away from suicide in the park as these reports did, I would want to see all the raw evidence for myself. But that's a personal feeling on my own behalf. And I don't think the rest of us who have an overriding interest in the integrity of our law enforcement agencies and the sanctity of our democracy should be guided by what the family thinks about whether important information should be released. Once I've proven, and I believe I have, that the government cannot be trusted to filter the raw evidence in this case, I think the public then has to see it for itself. And there's one other important point that I make here. The press is continually talking about these 5 investigations that have taken place. I had the chance to tell the Supreme Court, as I've told them in an earlier brief in this case at the petition level. The Senate Whitewater Committee, the senators there, Orrin Hatch and the others, stated at the outset that they were not looking into whether Vince Foster committed suicide or not. They were just examining the procedures that the park police used. So that was not an investigation of his death. We have the initial investigation done by the park police and the FBI. It's not just the park police. The FBI was involved from day one also. And that is in the record in this case. And in fact, in August of 1993, there was a joint press conference held by the Department of Justice, the FBI, and the Park Police, where they talked about their results. The Fisk and Starr offices used FBI agents as part of their investigation. That's uncontested. That's in the record. In other words, to reinvestigate what the FBI had originally investigated, they're using agents from that original investigating agency, the FBI. That's a conflict of interest. So we don't have these 5 separate investigations that has been continually put out to the public, falsely by the press, and just negligently so, because it's a claim that's often made by the government. So I really need you to look at that closely if you're going to repeat that again.
Do you have a theory about how Vince Foster died?
As to how he died, again, it's just educated guesswork, and I really don't have any theory. I just don't know. I just don't know. And that's the sad part of this. We shouldn't, as the public, have to guess about how such a high public official involved in a government investigation at the time dealing with the President of the United States that spawned several agencies looking at this. In other words, somebody felt that the previous agency didn't get it right or wasn't convincing enough, so the public should say, enough already. Let us, the public, look at the raw evidence for ourselves, because we cannot trust the government to filter the information.
You mentioned the lawsuit was first filed by your law firm. What is their interest of law? What is their practice?
Oh, no. This was a law firm I had worked at in 1997 at the time for a short time. So
what is that firm and what is their specialty?
Oh, they weren't even involved in this area of the law. They did immigration law, and I worked there for a time but left and took the case with me. And the only lawyer at the firm who worked on the case was me, you see. So it's inconsequential. And then I just became my own attorney of record since then, ever since. Working at other law firms, having other jobs, but always doing this on the side. So that's how that worked. Yes?
Why should the average American care whether or not Vince Foster committed suicide or was murdered in some sort of random crime, or if you, as you suggest somewhat darkly, was killed by the government? Why should they care?
Well, first of all, I'm not suggesting even darkly that he was killed by the government. I'm saying I don't know what happened. But the people should care, not necessarily about whether he committed suicide or was murdered in the abstract. It's always sad when somebody meets their end in either of those ways. But we should care as to how that death, however it occurred, was treated by the government, by the law enforcement agencies that help keep our democracy together. That's why it's important.
No one is guaranteed a perfect trial any more than they're guaranteed perfect justice. What if this was an imperfect investigation, not the first, and not the last in the history of this government or any other government?
It's a matter of degree. If we were talking about let's talk about one extreme, where the reports on the death just had the page numbering incorrect. Some very, very minor discrepancies. Then we wouldn't be talking about this case. But we're talking about the other extreme here. We're talking about an FBI memo that says there was no exit wound, directly contradicting the official version. And there's no discussion about that memo, which went to the director of the FBI in the Fisk and Starr reports. We're talking about a report by the only doctor to view the body at the park who said there was the death shot was mouth to neck. Again, contradicting the official story. These are not minor discrepancies. These have to be dealt with, and there may be innocent explanations for them. But we get no explanation of them from the Fisk and Starr reports. Contrary to what Mr. Hamilton said during the oral argument, where he said that the Starr report dealt with this problem at page 2 of the Hout report. That's false. Ken Starr's report ignored page 2 of the Hout report, cited page 1 of the Hout report, which had language that said mouth to head, directly contradicting what was on page 2. And in addition, on page 1 of the Hout report, which Ken Starr did not mention in his report, is that if you look at the copy of the report itself, which I can show you, it's in the record, and we have 3 certified copies of that report, page 1 appears to have some alteration that was made to it, where you use liquid paper, the white correcting fluid, and you try to blot out a word, but you don't get all of the ink, and so some small portion of the word remains. That's what we have in the record here, and there's no explanation about that. So I agree with you in theory that the public doesn't always have an overriding interest over whatever privacy interests may exist. You have to look at each case individually and see how great are the discrepancies and what are the surrounding circumstances. Obviously, Deputy White House Counsel, government investigation, and the top law enforcement agencies of the country involved, that makes the public interest higher. Yeah.
Thanks very much.
Thank you all very much.